The shuttle was falling apart around her, and Dr. Alara Vance could do nothing but hold on and pray she would survive the crash that was coming faster than she could think. Metal screamed and sparks flew everywhere as the small vessel tore through the atmosphere of a world she had never meant to visit. A world the Galactic Union had marked with red warnings and a simple message that said hostile fauna and avoid at all costs. She was supposed to be on a simple mission, just a routine geological survey of a moon 3 systems away. But the navigation computer had failed and sent her spiraling into the gravity well of Keth 7 before she could even understand what was happening. The trees came at her through the viewport like white spears reaching up from the ground, and she closed her eyes and braced herself for impact. The crash was violent and loud and terrible, throwing her against her restraints so hard that she thought her bones would break. But when the noise finally stopped and the dust began to settle, she found that she was still alive and still breathing. Alara hung upside down in her seat for a long moment, her head pounding and her vision swimming with spots of light, before she managed to release the buckle and fall to what had been the ceiling of the shuttle. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken, and she knew she had to move fast because shuttle crashes often led to fires and explosions. She crawled through the wreckage and pushed open a damaged panel and pulled herself out into the strangest forest she had ever seen in all her years of space exploration. The trees were bone white, and they stretched so high into the purple sky that she could not see where they ended, their branches twisting together like the fingers of giant hands reaching for something far above. The undergrowth glowed with soft blue and green light, bioluminescent plants that pulsed gently like they were breathing, and the air smelled sweet and sharp at the same time, like fruit and metal mixed together. She stood on shaking legs and looked back at her shuttle, and her heart sank when she saw how badly it was damaged. The hull cracked open like an egg and smoke rising from places that should never smoke. Her communication equipment was probably destroyed, and her chances of sending a distress signal were slim at best. But Alara was not a woman who gave up easily, and she had not survived 20 years of deep space missions by sitting down and crying when things went wrong. She searched through the wreckage for anything useful and managed to find a small survival kit that contained 3 days of ration bars and a water purifier and a thermal blanket and a knife that felt very small when she thought about what might be living in this forest. The xenobiology files she had read about Keth 7 came back to her mind like a warning bell ringing over and over again. The Vrethkai were the reason no one came to this world. Massive predators that hunted in packs and stood nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder with razor-sharp spines running down their backs, and intelligence that some scientists believed was close to sapient. No research team had ever returned from studying them, and the Union had simply decided that some worlds were not worth the cost of exploration. And now she was stranded on exactly that kind of world with nothing but a small knife and 3 days of food. She found a spot near the shuttle where 2 large roots formed a natural shelter, and she gathered dry material to build a fire, her hands working automatically while her mind raced through survival plans. Fire would keep her warm and might scare away smaller predators, but she knew deep in her gut that the Vrethkai would not fear fire because they feared nothing at all. As the sun began to set and the shadows grew long between the white trees, Alara got her fire burning and sat with her back against the shuttle wreckage and tried to slow her breathing and calm her racing heart. The forest came alive with sounds as darkness fell, clicks and chirps and distant howls that made her skin crawl with ancient human instincts, telling her to run and hide and find safety. But there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, and she knew that her best chance was to stay near the shuttle where any rescue team would look first. Hours passed, and she fed the fire with trembling hands and listened to the sounds of the alien night. And then she heard something different, something closer, the crack of branches breaking under heavy weight, and the soft padding of large feet moving through the undergrowth. Her hand found her knife, and she gripped it tightly, even though she knew it would be useless against what was coming. Yellow eyes appeared at the edge of the firelight, not one pair, but several, glowing like small suns in the darkness, beyond her tiny circle of safety. Low growls rolled through the night air like thunder, and she could hear them circling her, moving around her camp in a pattern that spoke of intelligence and hunting strategy. The Vrethkai had found her. She wanted to scream, and she wanted to run, but her body had frozen in place, as millions of years of evolution told her that movement meant death. The growls grew louder, and she could see shapes now. Massive four-legged forms with spines that caught the firelight and teeth that gleamed like wet bone. There was no escape and no rescue coming, and she was completely alone on a hostile world with the deadliest predators in the sector closing in around her. But somewhere deep inside her chest, past the fear and past the panic, a small voice reminded her that she was human, and humans had faced predators before, had faced lions and wolves and bears on the world where they were born. Humans had not survived by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being clever and stubborn, and refusing to accept death even when it seemed certain. So Alara did not run, and she did not scream, and she did not beg for mercy from creatures that would not understand her words anyway. She sat very still, and she watched the yellow eyes watching her, and she waited to see what the dawn would bring. The fire crackled and popped, and the eyes continued their slow circle around her camp, and somewhere, far away, a creature howled at the purple moon rising above the bone-white trees. She was terrified, but she was also determined because giving up was not something Dr. Alara Vance knew how to do. If these were to be her last hours, then she would face them with dignity and courage, and she would not give these predators the satisfaction of seeing a human break. The night stretched on forever, and she did not sleep, not for a single moment, watching and waiting and holding on to hope with both hands as the predators of Keth 7 circled closer and closer to her tiny fire. The first light of dawn crept through the bone-white trees and painted the forest in shades of gold and pink, and Alara was still alive, still sitting by her dying fire with her useless knife clutched in her aching hand. The yellow eyes had watched her all through the long, terrible night, but they had not attacked, and she did not understand why. As the light grew stronger, she began to see the shapes more clearly, and her breath caught in her throat when she realized what she was looking at. 3 Vrethkai stood at the edge of her camp, but they were not the massive adults she had expected. They were younger and smaller, though still larger than any wolf on Earth, with half-formed spines and legs that seemed too long for their bodies. Cubs, she realized with sudden understanding. These were cubs, and they had been watching her like children, pressing their faces against glass to see something strange and new. The adults were out there somewhere in the shadows. She could feel them watching, but they had sent their young ones forward first, and that told her something important about what was happening. This was a test. She had spent years studying pack dynamics on Earth before she ever left for the stars, and she knew how predators trained their young, how they taught them to hunt and to kill and to survive. The cubs were learning, and the adults were watching to see what would happen. If she ran, they would chase her because running triggered the hunting instinct in every predator across every world. If she cowered and showed fear, they would attack because weakness invited aggression. Fear was the trigger, and fear was what they expected from their prey. The largest of the 3 cubs stepped forward and lifted its lips to show teeth that were already fully grown and deadly sharp, a snarl building in its chest that sounded like rocks grinding together. The other 2 fanned out to either side of her. Their own growls joined the chorus, and she could see them working together in a pattern they had probably practiced on smaller creatures 100 times before. They were good at this, she thought. They were very good at being terrifying. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and every muscle in her body was screaming at her to flee, to scramble backward and run into the forest, even though she knew she would not make it 10 steps, But she did not run. Instead, she thought about all the things she knew about predators and prey, and the strange dance between them that had played out on countless worlds across the galaxy. She thought about how humans had survived on Earth, not by being stronger than the lions or faster than the wolves, but by being something the other animals did not expect. Humans were strange creatures who did not follow the rules that other animals lived by. And then she did something that no creature on Keth 7 had ever done before, something that would change everything that came after. She looked directly at the largest cub, held its yellow eyes with her own brown ones, and she smiled. It was not a nervous smile or a fearful grimace, but a real, genuine human smile that spread across her whole face and showed her teeth and crinkled the corners of her eyes. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The large cub stopped in the middle of its snarl, and its ears went flat against its head, and its whole body seemed to freeze, like a machine that had suddenly lost power. The other two cubs stopped as well, their growls dying in their throats as they looked at this strange, soft creature, who was doing something they had never seen any prey animal do. Baring teeth was a challenge in their world, a threat, a promise of violence to come. But this creature was not snarling and was not aggressive, and her body was relaxed and open and somehow welcoming. The signals were all wrong, and the cubs did not know what to do with prey that was not acting like prey. Elara kept smiling, and she slowly raised one hand, palm open and facing toward them, the universal gesture of peace that she hoped might mean something even to aliens. The large cub whimpered, actually whimpered like a confused puppy. And then it sat down on its haunches and tilted its head to the side like it was trying to solve a puzzle it had never encountered before. The other two cubs looked at their leader and then at Elara and then back at their leader, clearly waiting for someone to tell them what to do. She could almost hear them thinking, could almost see the confusion in their yellow eyes as they tried to fit this human into the categories they knew. Was she prey, or was she threat? Or was she something else entirely that they had no name for? Elara let out a slow breath and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The cubs were not attacking, and that meant she had time to think, time to figure out what to do next. She lowered her hand slowly and reached for her bag, moving with careful, deliberate motions that would not startle the young predators watching her every move. She pulled out a ration bar and unwrapped it slowly, the crinkling of the package making all three cubs lean forward with curiosity. She broke off a small piece and held it out toward the large cub, an offering, a gift, the beginning of something that might become trust. The cub sniffed the air and its nose twitched, and she could see it fighting between fear and curiosity as the strange smell of human food reached its nostrils. After a long moment, it crept forward on its belly, making itself small, approaching her the way a submissive pack member might approach a dominant one. Elara stayed perfectly still as the cub came close enough to touch, its warm breath washing over her hand, its yellow eyes locked on hers. It sniffed the ration bar once, twice, 3 times, and then its tongue flicked out and took the offering from her fingers with surprising gentleness. The other cubs made sounds of excitement and crowded forward, their fear forgotten in the face of this new and interesting development. Elara laughed. She could not help it, and the sound made all 3 cubs jump back in surprise before they crept forward again with even more curiosity than before. They had never heard laughter, and they did not know what it was, but it did not seem dangerous, and this strange creature seemed willing to share her food. Maybe their young minds seemed to be thinking, maybe this creature was not prey after all. Maybe she was something new. And somewhere in the shadows of the bone-white forest, yellow eyes watched and ancient minds considered, and a pack that had never known anything. But the hunt began to wonder if there might be other ways to live. The sun rose higher, and the cubs stayed close to Elara, sniffing her hair and her boots and the strange things in her bag. And she smiled at them and spoke to them in a soft voice, even though they could not understand her words. Something had changed in the clearing by the crashed shuttle. Something had begun that would never be undone. And the human woman who should have been prey sat among the predator cubs and wondered what would happen when the adults finally decided to show themselves. The cubs had been playing around Alara for nearly an hour when the forest went silent in a way that made her skin prickle with warning. Even the insects stopped their clicking, and the birds stopped their calls, and the only sound was the soft whisper of wind through the bone-white branches above. The cubs felt it too, and they scrambled to their feet and pressed close to each other, their half-formed spines rising along their backs in a display that was more fearful than threatening. Something was coming, something that made even predator children nervous. Alara rose slowly to her feet and turned toward the direction the cubs were staring, her heart beginning to race again as she prepared herself for whatever would emerge from the shadows. 5 massive shapes stepped out of the forest and into the clearing, each one standing taller than any earth horse, with spines that were fully formed, and gleaming sharp and muscles that rippled under fur the color of storm clouds. These were the adult Vrethkai, the ones who had been watching all through the night, and they moved with the easy confidence of creatures who had never encountered anything they could not kill. At the front of the group was a female. Alara could tell by the slight differences in build and the way the others deferred to her position. And she was the most magnificent and terrifying animal Alara had ever seen. Her fur was marked with silver streaks that spoke of age and experience, and her face bore scars from battles fought and won over many long years of survival. This was the Pack Mother, the leader, the one whose decision would determine whether Alara lived or died in the next few minutes. The Pack Mother approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured, her yellow eyes fixed on Alara with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way down to the soul. The cubs whimpered and backed away, giving their mother room, and Alara found herself standing alone in the clearing with the most dangerous predator on the planet walking toward her. Every instinct told her to run or to fight or to make herself small and hope to be overlooked. But she had already learned that those instincts would get her killed on this world. So she did something different. She lowered herself to one knee, making herself smaller but not submissive, meeting the Pack Mother's eyes with calm respect rather than challenge or fear. It was the posture of an equal offering recognition, the way one leader might greet another when neither wished to fight. The Pack Mother stopped a few paces away and tilted her massive head, studying this strange creature who did nothing the way prey was supposed to. The other adults fanned out behind their leader, watching and waiting, their bodies tense with readiness for whatever command might come. Alara could see intelligence in those yellow eyes, real thinking awareness that went beyond simple animal instinct. And she knew in that moment that the scientists who had called the Vrethkai near sapient had been wrong. These creatures were fully sapient, fully aware, with minds that could reason and plan and make choices. They had simply chosen to remain hidden from the galaxy, to let outsiders believe they were mere beasts so that no one would come to study or conquer or colonize their world. And now Alara was kneeling before their queen with nothing to offer but herself. She reached slowly into her bag, and the adults tensed but did not move as she pulled out another ration, bar, and unwrapped it with careful, deliberate motions. She placed it on the ground between herself and the Pack Mother, an offering of food which was one of the oldest forms of peacemaking across every culture she had ever studied. The Pack Mother lowered her head and sniffed the strange object, and Alara could see her nostrils flaring as she took in the unfamiliar scent. Long moments passed and no one moved, and the whole forest seemed to be holding its breath. Then the Pack Mother did something that made Alara's heart skip a beat, and her eyes fill with tears she did not expect. The great predators stepped forward, ignoring the food on the ground, and pressed her massive scarred head against Alara's open palm. It was acceptance. It was recognition. It was welcome. The other adults relaxed visibly, their spines lowering and their postures shifting from ready to fight to something that looked almost like curiosity. The cubs let out yips of excitement and tumbled over each other in their rush to reach Alara, suddenly free to investigate this new pack member who had somehow earned the approval of their mother. Alara laughed again, that strange sound that made all of Vrethkai ears twitch with fascination, and she found herself surrounded by curious predators sniffing her hair and her clothes and her skin. The pack mother sat back on her haunches and watched with what Alara could have sworn was amusement as her cubs climbed over the human and poked her with their noses and made sounds of discovery and delight. One of the cubs, the smallest one with lighter coloring than its siblings, crawled into Alara's lap and curled up like it belonged there. She stroked its half-formed spines without thinking, and the cub made a rumbling sound in its chest that was almost like purring. The other adults approached one by one, each sniffing her and touching her with their noses in what seemed to be some kind of greeting ritual. She was being introduced to the pack, and she was being accepted, and she could hardly believe this was happening. Hours ago, she had been certain she was going to die, and now she was sitting in a circle of the deadliest predators in the sector being groomed by cubs and examined by adults like she was the most interesting thing they had ever encountered. The pack mother made a low sound, and the other adults responded with sounds of their own, and Alara realized they were communicating, actually talking to each other in a language she could not understand but could somehow feel. They were discussing her, she knew, making decisions about what to do with this strange creature who had fallen from the sky. After what felt like hours of watching and sniffing and quiet conversation, the pack mother rose to her feet and looked at Alara with those ancient, intelligent eyes. She made a sound that was clearly a command, and then turned and began walking into the forest. The other adults followed immediately, and the cubs scrambled off Alara and bounded after their mother, the smallest one turning back to look at her with an expression that was almost questioning. Were they leaving her behind? Had she failed some tests she did not understand? But then the pack mother stopped and turned her head and looked directly at Alara and made that same sound again, more insistent this time. It was not a dismissal, Alara realized with sudden joy. It was an invitation. She was being asked to follow. She grabbed her bag and scrambled to her feet and hurried after the pack, leaving the crash shuttle behind without a second thought. The cubs danced around her as she walked, nipping at her heels and bumping against her legs like they were herding her along. And the pack mother led them deeper into the bone-white forest, toward whatever home awaited in the shadows. Alara did not know what would happen next, but for the first time since the crash she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. She felt like she belonged, and the pack that had never accepted an outsider in all the long ages of their existence walked with a human in their midst and wondered what strange new future this might bring. 3 weeks had passed since Alara followed the pack into the forest, and in that time she had learned more about the Vrethkai than any human had ever known before. The den was a vast network of caves carved into the base of a mountain, warm and dry and filled with the smells of the pack. And Alara had been given her own small chamber near the entrance where the cubs could easily find her. She had named them in her mind, those 3 young ones who had been sent to test her on that first morning. The largest one, the male who had challenged her first and then sat down in confusion, she called Ghost because of the way he moved through the forest like a pale shadow. The second one, a female with teeth that seemed slightly larger than her siblings, she called Fang for obvious reasons. And the smallest one, the one who had crawled into her lap that first day and who still slept curled against her every night, she called Little One because no other name seemed to fit. The cubs had adopted her completely, and they followed her everywhere she went, watching her with fascination as she did strange human things that made no sense to them. They did not understand why she could not eat the meat they brought her. Fresh kills dropped proudly at her feet like precious gifts. She praised them every time anyway, scratching behind their ears and making sounds of appreciation. And then she would go find the roots and fruits and nuts she had learned were safe to eat. The adults watched her foraging with something like concern, clearly worried about this pack member who could not hunt for herself. And sometimes the pack mother would leave pieces of organ meat near Alara's cave, the most nutritious parts of any kill. Alara could not explain that her human stomach would not accept raw meat, so she simply smiled and moved the gifts aside and hoped she was not causing offense. Fire was the thing that amazed them most. The first time she built a small fire in the cave entrance, the whole pack had gathered to watch, their eyes wide with wonder and a little bit of fear as flames danced in the darkness. Ghost had crept close enough to singe his nose and had yelped and jumped back and then crept close again because curiosity was stronger than caution in the young. The pack mother had watched the longest, her intelligent eyes studying the flames and then studying the human who had somehow captured light itself. Alara began to understand their language over time, not the words because there were no words, but the sounds and gestures and postures that carried meaning between pack members. A low rumble meant contentment. A high whine meant distress or warning. A particular tilt of the head was a question. Flattened ears could mean fear or submission or concentration, depending on what the rest of the body was doing. She learned to read them, and they learned to read her, and slowly a kind of communication began to form between species who had never met before. The cubs taught her to play rough tumbling games that left her covered in bruises but laughing with joy, and the adults taught her the boundaries of the territory and where the best water could be found. She was becoming part of something larger than herself, and she had never felt so alive. But peace could not last forever on a world where survival was always uncertain. The rival pack came on a morning when the sky was dark with clouds and the air smelled like coming rain. Alara heard the warning howls first, the adults calling to each other in voices that spoke of danger and battle, and she emerged from her cave to find chaos spreading through the den. The cubs were being herded toward the deepest chambers where they would be safe, and Alara went with them on instinct, her heart pounding as she heard sounds of fighting from somewhere outside. Ghost and Fang pressed against her legs, their young bodies trembling with fear and excitement, and Little One climbed into her arms and buried her face against Alara's neck. Through the cave opening, she could see flashes of movement, bodies clashing, spines drawing blood as two packs fought for territory and dominance. The pack mother was in the thick of it, her silver-streaked fur now streaked with red as well, fighting with a fury that took Alara's breath away. But they were outnumbered. She could see that clearly. The rival pack was larger and fresher, and fighting with the desperate hunger of creatures who wanted what this pack had. And then she saw the shape coming toward the cave entrance, a massive male from the rival pack who had broken through the line of defenders and was heading straight for where the cubs were hidden. Straight for where Alara stood with Little One in her arms. The male was enormous, even bigger than the pack mother, with scars that spoke of many battles won, and eyes that held nothing but killing intent. The cubs behind her whimpered and pressed closer together, and Alara knew that she should run deeper into the caves, should hide, should protect herself, and hope the pack could defeat this enemy. But she thought about the pack mother fighting outside, about all the weeks of acceptance and belonging, about what it meant to truly be part of something. And she did something that no prey animal would ever do. She put Little One down gently and told the cubs to stay back, and then she walked out to meet the rival alpha. She walked toward danger instead of away from it. The massive male stopped in surprise, his charge interrupted by this strange small creature who was coming at him with her arms spread wide and her teeth bared in that confusing knot snarl. And then Alara screamed. She screamed with everything she had, all the fear and all the fury and all the wild human defiance that had let her ancestors face down predators on a planet far away. The sound bounced off the cave walls and echoed through the forest, and every creature in the battle paused for just a moment at this new and terrifying noise. The rival alpha hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just long enough to try to understand what this screaming creature was and whether she was dangerous. And that hesitation cost him everything. The pack mother struck from the side like silver lightning, her teeth finding his throat before he could turn to face her, and the battle was over in an instant. The rival pack fled, their alpha fallen, and the defenders let out howls of victory that shook the bone-white trees. The pack mother stood over her defeated enemy, breathing hard, blood dripping from a dozen wounds, and she looked at Alara with something new in her ancient eyes. Respect. The cubs burst from the cave and swarmed around Alara, licking her face and hands and making sounds of joy and relief. The other adults approached one by one and touched their noses to her, a gesture she now understood as deep acknowledgement. And the pack mother walked to her and pressed that great scarred head against her palm, just as she had on the day they first met. But this time, it meant something more. This time, it meant that Alara was not just accepted, she was valued. She had proven herself in the way that mattered most to creatures who lived by strength and courage, and the willingness to fight for what was theirs. From that day forward, the pack watched over her like a treasure, like something precious that must be protected at all costs. And Alara understood that she had found something she had never expected to find on this hostile world. She had found a family. 43 days had passed since the crash, and Alara had almost forgotten that there was a galaxy beyond the bone-white forest and the warm caves of the den. She woke each morning with the little one curled against her side, and Ghost and Fang waiting impatiently at the entrance of her chamber, eager for another day of exploration and play. She had learned to read the weather in the way the pack mother lifted her nose to the wind, and she had learned to find food in places she never would have noticed on her own. The pack had taught her to move quietly through the forest and to listen for danger and to understand the thousand small sounds that made up the voice of this alien world. She was dirty and tired, and her clothes were falling apart, but she had never been happier in her entire life. And then the sound came from the sky. It started as a distant roar that made the Vrethkai lift their heads with suspicion, and Alara's heart skip a beat with sudden recognition. A shuttle was descending through the clouds, its engines burning bright against the purple morning sky, and Alara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what this meant. Someone had finally come looking for her. The rescue vessel settled in a clearing not far from the old crash site, and Alara watched from the trees with the pack arrayed around her, all of them tense and uncertain about this new development. Armed figures emerged from the shuttle, soldiers in full combat gear with weapons drawn and scanners beeping warnings about the massive predators hiding in the forest. The pack growled low in their throats, and Alara could feel them preparing to fight, to protect their territory from these new invaders who smelled of metal and aggression. She had to act quickly before someone got hurt. She stepped out of the trees with her hands raised and her voice loud and clear, calling out to the rescue team before they could do something foolish. The soldiers spun toward her with weapons pointed, and she heard gasps of shock as they saw the state she was in, covered in dirt and wearing scraps of clothing and looking more wild than civilized. Behind her, the pack emerged from the forest like ghosts made solid. Ghost and Fang and Little One at her heels, and the adults, fanning out in a protective formation that made the soldiers tighten their grips on their weapons. The team leader, a woman with captain's bars on her shoulder, stared at the scene with eyes so wide they looked like they might fall out of her head. She had clearly never seen anything like this in all her years of service. Alara walked toward them slowly, the cubs bouncing along beside her and the pack mother moving like a silver shadow at her right. She told them to stand down, that these creatures were not a threat, that everything they thought they knew about the Vrethkai was wrong. The captain looked at the massive predators surrounding this ragged scientist and clearly struggled to believe what she was seeing. She asked how this was possible, how Alara had survived for so long among creatures that had killed every researcher who had ever tried to study them. Alara smiled and reached down to scratch behind Ghost's ears and told them it was simple. She had shown them respect instead of fear and curiosity instead of aggression, and they had responded in kind. The Vrethkai were not mindless killers. They were intelligent beings who had simply never had a reason to trust anything from the stars before. The soldiers lowered their weapons slowly, still nervous but willing to trust the woman who stood so calmly among the predators. Little One crept forward to sniff at the captain's boots, and the woman froze in terror, until the cub sneezed and bounded back to Alara's side. The pack mother watched all of this with those ancient, intelligent eyes, and Alara knew she was judging these new humans, deciding whether they were threats or something else. The captain asked Alara if she was ready to come home, if she wanted to get off this planet and back to civilization where she belonged. And Alara felt her heart crack down the middle, because this was the choice she had known would come eventually. She could leave this world and return to her old life, to clean sheets and hot food and human company. Or she could stay. She looked at Ghost and Fang and Little One, who were watching her with confusion in their yellow eyes, sensing that something important was happening but not understanding what. She looked at the pack mother, who had accepted her and protected her and taught her what it meant to truly belong. She thought about everything she had learned, all the things the galaxy would never know if she simply walked away. And she made her choice. She told the captain that she was not leaving, that she was going to stay and establish the first Vrethkai research station right here on Keth 7. The captain stared at her like she had lost her mind, and maybe she had. Maybe spending weeks among predators had broken something inside her brain. But Alara did not care, because she had never felt more certain of anything in her life. She would need supplies, she said, building materials and food and a long-range communicator so she could send reports back to the Union. She would study the Vrethkai properly, learn their language and their culture and everything about how they lived. She would show the galaxy that these creatures were not monsters to be avoided, but people to be understood. The captain argued and pleaded and warned her about the dangers, but Alara would not be moved. Finally, the woman sighed and agreed to bring back what Alara requested, because there was clearly no changing this stubborn scientist's mind. The shuttle departed with a roar of engines, and Alara stood in the clearing with her pack and watched it climb toward the stars. Ghost and Fang and Little One howled as the vessel disappeared into the clouds. Strange, mournful sounds that echoed through the forest. And Alara, without thinking, tilted back her head and howled with them. Her human voice cracked on the high notes and wavered on the low ones, but the pack heard her and responded with howls of their own. The whole forest rang with their combined voices, a chorus of belonging that spoke louder than any words ever could. The pack mother pressed against. Alara sighed and made that rumbling sound that meant contentment, and Alara wrapped her arms around that great furry neck and held on tight. She was home. 3 years later, when the first Vrethkai voluntarily approached a human settlement on the other side of Keth 7, the colonists did not know what to do. They panicked and grabbed weapons and prepared for an attack that never came. The pack's leader, a now massive male with distinctive silver markings on his face, simply sat down in the middle of their compound and tilted his head to the side. The colonist xenolinguist was the first to understand what she was seeing. "He's smiling," she whispered. "He's actually smiling at us." And far away in her research station, surrounded by cubs and adults and the endless wonders of a world she had made her own, Dr. Alara Vance smiled too. Ghost had grown up well. She had taught him everything she knew, and now he was teaching others and the bridge between humans, and Vrethkai was growing stronger every day. This was her legacy. She thought, not papers or awards or academic recognition. Her legacy was a smile, passed from species to species, a simple gift that had changed everything. And somewhere in the bone-wide forest, little one pressed against Elara's side and made that rumbling sound of contentment. All was well. All was exactly as it should be.